German Shepherd refused to move from the graveyard. What happened next shattered everyone. Sometimes, the smallest actions create the biggest changes. What began as pain soon turned into hope, and a story no one will forget. But before we begin, answer this. Do you believe kindness can still change the world? If you believe in kindness, like, share, and subscribe to spread the message. The night was heavy with fog, the kind that wrapped itself around the trees and gravestones like a ghostly blanket. At the edge of the small town, the graveyard sat in silence, its crooked headstones barely visible in the dim glow of the moon. The air was still, too still, carrying only the sound of the cold wind brushing through the brittle grass. Most people avoided this place after dark. It was said to hold memories better left undisturbed. But on this night, something broke the silence. A bark, sharp, urgent, and filled with a force that echoed across the empty ground. A German shepherd stood at the far corner of the graveyard, his strong body framed by the fog. His ears were pinned forward, his eyes locked on a single forgotten grave. He barked again, then whined, pacing restlessly before dropping to the earth and scratching at the ground as if begging someone to notice. The dog's breath rose in quick clouds against the night air. His fur bristled, his tail stiff with unease. He did not move from the spot. He would not leave. It was as though some unseen bond tied him to that grave, something he sensed but no human eye could yet see. A few townsfolk on their way home heard the sound and paused. Who would expect barking in the graveyard at this hour? An old man carrying his lantern stopped at the gate and squinted through the mist. Across the road, a mother hushed her child and pointed. More faces appeared at the edge of the fog, drawn by the strange cries that refused to fade. The shepherd barked again, louder this time, his paws scraping against the cracked earth. His body trembled with urgency, but his eyes never wavered from the grave before him. The headstone was old and leaning, its writing long faded by rain and time. No one in the crowd could remember who had been buried there, or why the dog would care. But the sound of his cries carried something that made their hearts beat faster. It was not just barking. It was grief, it was warning, it was need. Whispers began to spread among the people. "Why won't he leave?" someone asked. Another shook their heads slowly. "Dogs know things we don't. Maybe he senses something buried there." The fog thickened, wrapping around their words like a shroud. Children were pulled closer to their parents, and even the bravest men shifted uneasily on their feet. The graveyard had always been a place of silence. Tonight, it felt alive, trembling beneath the sound of one dog's desperate call. And then a little girl in a simple blue dress stepped forward. She was no more than 3, her small hand clinging to her grandmother's arm before she let go and walked across the grass. The German shepherd turned the moment he heard her footsteps. His body lowered slightly, his growl softened, but he did not leave his post. Instead, he wagged his tail once, as though inviting her to come closer, then returned his gaze to the grave. The baby girl crouched beside him, her tiny fingers brushing through his fur. "What is it, boy?" she whispered in her innocent voice. But the shepherd only whined again, pawing harder at the earth. The child's eyes lifted to the adults who stood frozen at the edge of the mist. Her voice was small but clear. "He wants us to see." The people shivered, not from the cold, but from the truth in her words. Something was hidden here. Something that the dog had refused to leave behind. No one yet knew what waited beneath the soil, sealed for years in silence. But every heart felt the same fear and the same pull. Because sometimes, when a dog refuses to move, it is not stubbornness. It is loyalty. It is love. It is truth trying to break free. And what they discovered next would shatter them in ways they would never forget. The graveyard had always carried a silence deeper than most places. It sat at the very edge of town, where the cobblestone road thinned into dirt and the trees grew wild and untrimmed. The old stone wall that once circled the yard had crumbled in many places, leaving gaps where wind and fog wandered freely. Gravestones leaned at odd angles, cracked and worn down by years of rain, their inscriptions long faded. Wild grass grew high and tangled, hiding the paths that families once followed when they came to mourn. At night, the place looked less like a resting ground and more like a forgotten corner of time. For years, most townsfolk kept their distance. Children were warned not to play near the gate, and the elderly often crossed to the other side of the road rather than walk past. Everyone knew the graveyard was harmless, just a patch of ground and stone, yet whispers lived around it. Old stories told of people who entered at dusk and felt strange chills, as though unseen eyes watched them. A farmer once swore he heard soft crying there when no one was around. A widow spoke of dreams that brought her back to the graveyard even years after her husband's burial. Whether true or not, such tales were enough to give the place a weight of sadness that few cared to disturb. Yet one morning, something changed. A German shepherd appeared at the gate. Strong, noble, with a coat that caught the light of dawn, he walked straight into the graveyard as though he had been called. His paws pressed over the wild grass until he reached an old grave at the far corner, half hidden beneath ivy. There he sat, his ears sharp, his eyes fixed. From that day forward, the dog returned again and again. At first, people thought little of it. Perhaps he was a stray looking for shelter. Perhaps he had followed a scent. But the more they noticed, the more uneasy they became. Rain or shine, morning or night, the shepherd was there. He would sit by the same grave, sometimes lying down with his head on his paws, sometimes circling and pawing at the earth, other times barking into the empty air as though demanding someone to listen. He ate little, drank little, and never seemed to rest for long. Curiosity grew. Neighbors whispered over fences, wondering whose grave had captured the dog's devotion. Some said it must have been his master's. Others feared it belonged to someone who had died tragically, their spirits still unsettled. But no one could remember who rested beneath that weathered stone. The name had long disappeared, the letters carved too shallow to fight against time. To most, it was simply another forgotten grave in a forgotten yard. Yet to the shepherd, it was everything. And then came the day the little girl followed him. She was only 3 years old, her blue dress fluttering as she toddled across the grass. Her tiny shoes left faint marks on the dirt path as she clutched a ragged toy in one hand and reached out with the other. The German shepherd, sensing her, slowed his steps. He looked back at her with eyes that carried both strength and sorrow, then continued toward the grave as if inviting her to see. Her grandmother called after her, but the child would not stop. The bond between the girl and her dog was stronger than fear. The townsfolk had often seen them together, the shepherd walking close to her side, patient and protective, guiding her small steps with gentle nudges. She trusted him in ways words could not describe. And on this day, she trusted him still, even as he led her into the place others avoided. When she reached the grave, she crouched beside him, her small hands brushing through the wild grass. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, her innocent voice carrying in the quiet. The dog whined, pressing his paw against the earth. The child tilted her head, watching him with wide eyes as though she, too, felt the weight of something unseen. The sight stirred those who were watching from afar. A few neighbors had stopped at the gate, expecting the shepherd to chase away the child or wander off as dogs sometimes do. Instead, he stayed rooted, as if guarding her, as if showing her something no one else could understand. From that day on, the little girl became part of his vigil. Each morning, she would tug at her grandmother's hand until they reached the graveyard. She would sit beside her dog, humming softly or whispering words that only he seemed to hear. The shepherd never left her side. And when the sun began to set, he would walk her home, only to return again when darkness fell. The graveyard, once a place of silence and sorrow, began to draw more curious eyes. People noticed how the child's laughter echoed through the stones, how the dog's steady bark broke through the fog. The old sadness of the place seemed to stir, not in anger but in restless anticipation. It was as if the forgotten grave itself was waiting for the day when its secret would no longer be buried beneath dust and weeds. And in the center of it all stood the German shepherd, refusing to move, refusing to forget, carrying a loyalty that even time could not silence. Day after day, the shepherd returned to the same grave. Morning light, evening fog, even under the pale glow of the moon, it did not matter. His body remained there, strong and unmoving, like a guardian carved out of stone. Yet his restlessness betrayed him. He would sit for hours, his chest rising and falling with heavy sighs, his eyes locked on the ground as though it held a secret only he could see. Sometimes he lay flat, his nose pressed to the earth, his ears twitching at sounds no one else could hear. Other times he circled the grave, his paws disturbing the overgrown grass until patches of soil showed beneath. He scratched often, claws tearing at the dirt in short bursts, then stopping as if listening. A low growl would rumble from his chest, not fierce enough to frighten, but deep enough to stir unease in those who heard it. Then, without warning, he would whine, his voice trembling with frustration and sorrow, before lowering his body once again beside the headstone. To the townsfolk who dared to watch from the gate, the dog's vigil looked less like stubbornness and more like grief. The baby girl followed him as faithfully as his shadow. In her little blue dress, she would toddle after him with her toy clutched tightly, her small feet barely keeping pace with his long stride. At the grave, she would crouch beside him, touching his fur with her tiny fingers. Her young heart did not understand his unease, but her eyes told a different story. She could feel it, the weight pressing on him, the way his body tensed and trembled as though carrying a message too heavy for words. Sometimes she would tilt her head and whisper softly, "What are you saying, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" The shepherd would glance at her then, his amber eyes softening for a brief moment, before turning back to the grave with steady resolve. He would paw at the earth again, his nails raking against stone and soil, dust rising into the air. The little girl's laughter would fade into quiet watchfulness as she leaned against him, trusting him even when she did not understand. It wasn't long before neighbors began to notice. They gathered near the fence, pretending to pass by on errands, their eyes drawn to the scene. Whispers started small, like ripples across still water. "Why won't he leave that spot?" one woman asked, clutching her shawl closer. "I've never seen an animal so determined," muttered a farmer, shaking his head. "Dogs don't waste their strength for nothing." The teacher, who remembered the graveyard from her childhood, frowned deeply as she spoke. "There's pain in that place. Maybe he feels it." Her words sent shivers through the listeners. Each day, the crowd at the edge grew larger. Some came with curiosity, others with unease. A few came with lanterns at night, drawn by the echo of his barking across the sleeping town. The sound was never angry, but insistent, carrying a plea that tugged at the heart. And always, beside him, sat the little girl, her presence softening the edge of fear, her innocent trust keeping people from turning away completely. Yet the unease spread. The graveyard was already a place of sadness, a place people avoided for fear of the memories it carried. Now, with the shepherd's endless vigil, that sadness turned to something sharper. "What if there's something buried there that shouldn't be?" an old man whispered one evening, his eyes darting nervously across the stones. "What if he's guarding something?" The grandmother, holding the little girl's hand as she watched her dog scratch at the earth, shook her head. "No," she said softly. "He isn't guarding. He's calling." Her words lingered in the air long after she spoke them. Calling. The thought unsettled the crowd. What was the dog calling them to? What lay beneath the earth that made him so restless? Each time he barked, they felt it in their bones, a reminder that animals often sense truths that human eyes refuse to see. And still, the shepherd refused to move. Rain slicked his fur, frost bit at his paws, yet his body stayed rooted by the grave. His tail never wagged here, his playful nature vanished. He was not a pet in these moments, he was something else. A sentinel, a messenger, a soul refusing to be silenced. The townsfolk began to argue quietly among themselves. Some wanted to chase the dog away, believing his presence stirred up restless spirits. Others said he must be protected, for only he knew what was hidden. Fear and curiosity twisted together, spreading through the town like the fog that rolled in each evening. Yet through it all, the little girl's faith never wavered. She came each day with her small steps, her soft words, her gentle touch on the shepherd's back. To her, he was not frightening, not strange. He was simply speaking a language only her heart could understand. And while the rest of the town whispered and wondered, she sat beside him quietly, waiting for the day when his message would finally be revealed. It began quietly, with just a few neighbors stopping at the edge of the graveyard, curious about the shepherd's strange devotion. But as the days passed, more people came. At first, they lingered in the shadows, whispering among themselves, watching the dog with wary eyes. Then slowly, they stepped inside the crumbling gate, their lanterns flickering as they followed the sound of his restless paws against the earth. The first to arrive regularly was the farmer, Mr. Harris, a man whose face was weathered by years of working the fields. He carried the smell of soil on his clothes and the strength of a man used to hard labor, but his eyes softened when he looked at the shepherd. His own son had been buried in this same graveyard many years ago after a fever swept through the town. Though his boy rested far from the shepherd's chosen grave, Harris could not help but feel the dog's sorrow tugging at his own. "Animals grieve too," he muttered one evening, watching the dog paw at the ground. "Sometimes better than we do." Then came Miss Carter, the schoolteacher. She had lived in the town all her life, teaching generations of children until her hair turned silver and her steps grew slow. She had known loss as well, bearing her younger brother when she was only a girl. The memory had never left her, and seeing the shepherd's devotion stirred something deep in her chest. "Dogs do not linger without reason," she told the crowd that gathered one night. "They sense what we cannot. They feel what we choose to forget." Grandmother Elsie, with her kind but tired eyes, began to visit too. She carried her walking stick and the weight of years of grief. She had outlived both her husband and her only son, and though her heart had broken long ago, she never let her tears fall in front of others. Yet here, as she watched the shepherd refuse food, refuse rest, she wept quietly into her handkerchief. "It is loyalty," she whispered to the baby girl at her side. "Your dog is showing us the kind of love that never ends." Even the local policeman, Officer Miller, who was usually skeptical of old tales, began to appear in uniform after his evening rounds. At first, he came to make sure no mischief was stirring in the graveyard. But when he saw the shepherd circling, growling low, then pressing his body against the faded headstone as if guarding it, the officer felt his duty shift. He remembered a missing child from decades ago, a case never solved, a memory that haunted the town's records. And he wondered if the dog's cries were not only for the present but for the past as well. Together, these townsfolk formed an unlikely circle around the grave. They shared no plan, no purpose, only a growing awareness that something greater was unfolding before them. Each carried their own loss, their own sorrow, and somehow the shepherd's devotion seemed to give voice to the grief they had buried. The dog did not stop. His paws were raw from scratching at the earth, but still he clawed, sending small sprays of soil into the air. When neighbors brought scraps of food, he barely sniffed at them. When offered water, he drank only enough to soothe his throat before returning to his post. His body grew thinner, but his resolve never wavered. He would not leave. The little girl stayed with him, her blue dress brushing the grass as she sat cross-legged at his side. Sometimes she hummed softly, her child's voice carrying in the stillness, as though singing to calm his weary heart. Sometimes she patted the earth herself, copying his movements in her innocent way. To her, it was not strange to sit by a grave with her loyal friend. It was simply where he needed her to be. The crowd watched in awe and unease. Some muttered that the dog was bewitched, that he had fallen under the spell of the dead. Others insisted he was simply remembering his master. But deep down, no one could ignore the feeling that pulsed in the air, a heaviness, a call, a story trapped beneath the soil, trying to be told. One evening, when the fog hung low and the lanterns cast long, quivering shadows, the farmer finally spoke what others had only thought. "Should we dig?" His voice was rough, uncertain. He stared at the grave as though it might answer him. The teacher frowned. "It is a resting place. Disturbing it would be unholy." "But look at him," Grandmother Elsie said, her voice trembling. "Look at how he suffers. He knows something is there." Officer Miller rubbed his chin, his eyes narrowed on the shepherd's raw paws. "Animals don't lie," he said firmly. "If he's this insistent, there's a reason. Maybe it's not just the past he's trying to show us. Maybe it's something waiting now." The group fell silent, their breaths visible in the cold air. They turned their eyes back to the shepherd, who had stopped scratching for a moment. He stood tall, his chest rising and falling, his eyes burning with a light that sent shivers down their spines. Then he barked once, sharp, commanding, and lowered his body to the earth again, pawing with renewed strength. The baby girl leaned against him, her voice small but clear. "He wants us to see." Her words struck them like a bell. The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Fear battled with curiosity, reverence with desperation. What if they uncovered something they were not meant to find? What if disturbing the grave brought sorrow greater than the one already known? Yet the image of the shepherd, loyal and unwavering, tore at their hesitation. The graveyard was no longer a place of silence. It was alive with tension, with whispers, with the sound of claws and the beating of human hearts. And standing at the edge of it all, the people knew they were no longer just spectators. They were part of a story being written in the dirt, one that demanded to be uncovered. The night had turned colder, the kind of cold that seemed to sink into the bones. A damp mist clung to the graveyard, swirling between the crooked stones and broken markers as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The small crowd that had gathered earlier in whispers now stood in tense silence, their lanterns flickering weakly against the fog. At last, the farmer, Mr. Harris, returned from his barn with 2 old shovels slung over his shoulder. Another man followed with a crowbar, and the policeman carried a sturdy lantern that cast long, dancing shadows over the grass. Their boots crunched against the frost-hardened ground as they approached the shepherd, who was still circling the grave with the same relentless devotion. The dog's eyes flashed in the lantern light, pleading, urging. "Lord, help us," Miss Carter whispered, clutching her shawl close around her shoulders. "We're about to disturb the dead." But the shepherd whined softly, pressing his head against the baby girl's side, and the child patted him gently as if to say, "It's all right, I'm here with you." Her trust seemed to steady everyone else. With a deep breath, the farmer drove the first shovel into the soil. The sharp ring of iron against earth echoed across the graveyard, startling the crows that had been resting in the trees above. They burst into the night sky, their wings beating like drums. The sound sent a shiver down every spine. Another shovel struck, then another. Soon, the graveyard was filled with the rhythm of digging, iron biting into damp soil, the grunt of men leaning into their work, the heavy thud of earth being tossed aside. The smell of wet ground rose around them, rich and cold, filling their lungs with the scent of something long hidden. The shepherd pawed at the edge, whining louder now, his body pressed so close to the diggers that they had to nudge him back. Yet he would not move far. His eyes followed every shovelful of dirt, every scrape of iron, his ears flat against his head as if begging them to hurry. "Careful," Officer Miller muttered. "We don't know what we'll find." But still the digging went on. Sweat formed on brows despite the winter air, steam rising from the men's shoulders as they worked under the lantern light. The teacher prayed softly under her breath, her lips trembling with each word. Grandmother Elsie clutched her stick, her knuckles white, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The grave resisted at first, the soil packed firm with years of silence. But gradually, the earth began to loosen. The sound changed, the dull thuds became hollow in places, the ground beneath them shifting, almost sighing as though it had been waiting for this moment. The shepherd suddenly barked, sharp and insistent, his front paws scraping against a specific corner of the grave. His claws tore at the soil with desperate urgency, his chest heaving with effort. The baby girl pointed with her tiny hand, her voice ringing out in the heavy silence. "There! He wants it open there." The men obeyed. They focused their shovels where the shepherd scratched, their muscles straining as the ground grew softer, darker, damp with hidden moisture. The sound of iron striking wood came suddenly, echoing like a drumbeat in the cold night. Everyone froze. For a moment, silence hung heavy over them, broken only by the ragged breath of the dog and the faint rustling of the trees. Then the farmer leaned down, brushing away soil with his calloused hands until the outline of something solid appeared beneath the dirt. It was not a coffin. It was something else. The lantern light revealed the edge of old, weathered planks, fitted together like the top of a sealed box. The wood was damp but still sturdy, marked with strange stains that no one dared name. A hush fell over the group, each person staring as though they were gazing into the mouth of a secret they were not sure they wanted to know. "What is it?" Miss Carter whispered, her voice barely a breath. The policeman knelt, running his gloved fingers over the wood. "Not a coffin," he said quietly. "Too shallow. Looks more like a hatch." The word hung in the air, chilling everyone. A hidden hatch, buried beneath a forgotten grave. Who had built it? And why had it been sealed away? The shepherd pressed his body against it now, whining low and long, his eyes pleading in a way no human words could match. His tail did not wag. His ears did not lift. This was not excitement. It was grief, urgency, fear. He wanted them to open it. He needed them to. The farmer fetched the crowbar, his hands trembling slightly as he wedged the iron into the crack between the planks. With a groan of old wood and a sharp creak of rusted nails, the hatch resisted, as though unwilling to give up its secret. But the men pressed harder, their faces grim with determination. The baby girl clutched her shepherd tightly, her blue dress brushing against the damp earth as she whispered, "It's okay, boy. They're going to help." Finally, with a sound like a sigh, the hatch gave way. The planks split apart, releasing a rush of stale, cold air that smelled of dampness and decay. The lantern light flickered wildly as if disturbed by an unseen hand, and everyone stepped back, covering their mouths against the sudden breath of the underground. The shepherd barked once, then peered into the opening, his body tense, his nose twitching as he inhaled what lay below. His growl rumbled low in his chest, not of anger, but of warning. The crowd leaned closer, their eyes wide, their hearts pounding. And as the lantern was lowered, its flame casting light into the darkness beneath, the first glimpse of what lay hidden sent a chill through every soul standing there. What they saw was not just earth. It was not just wood. It was the first piece of a truth long buried, waiting to be uncovered. And as the shepherd whined again, pressing his body protectively against the child at his side, everyone knew whatever lay beneath that hatch was going to change the town forever. The cold breath that escaped from the broken earth made everyone shiver. It carried with it a dampness that spoke of years gone by, of secrets pressed deep into the soil. The lantern flames quivered as though afraid, their glow barely pushing back the darkness rising from the hole. A silence fell over the crowd, so complete that they could hear the sharp panting of the German shepherd as he stood, rigid and alert, at the edge. The farmer leaned down first, his weathered hands brushing away more dirt. Soon the outline of a wooden box became clear, large, old, its planks swollen with moisture but still intact. Rusted nails clung stubbornly to the wood, and the edges were darkened as if time itself had burned them. The sight of it made hearts race. It was not a coffin, but it was not an ordinary box either. It was something built to hide, not to be found. The shepherd lowered his head and growled, a deep rumble that rolled out of his chest. He placed his paw firmly on the wood as though claiming it, warning them all to keep back. The baby girl tugged softly at his fur, whispering, "It's okay, boy. They're here to help." Her tiny voice soothed him only slightly. His growl faded into a whine, but his body stayed pressed against the box, his amber eyes watching everyone with an intensity that made them hesitate. The policeman crouched down, lantern in hand, and studied the wood. "This isn't new," he said quietly. "Whoever sealed this didn't want it seen again." Grandmother Elsie's voice cracked as she clutched her stick tighter. Sometimes things are buried because they are too painful to face. Her eyes glistened with tears, old memories stirring as the smell of sorrow mixed with the night air. The farmer and another man used their tools again. The crowbar slipped beneath the edge, iron against wood, straining against nails that screamed with rust as they were pulled free. Every creak seemed to echo louder than it should, like a voice from the past protesting their efforts. The shepherd whined louder, circling the box, pressing close again and again, as if urging them to hurry yet guarding what lay within. Finally, the lid shifted. The wood groaned, splintering under the pressure, and then lifted with a hollow snap. A rush of stale air spilled out, heavy and suffocating, carrying with it a smell no one could mistake, the scent of long-forgotten sorrow, of decay softened by years, of grief trapped in silence. People turned away, covering their mouths and noses, but their eyes never left the opening. Inside, the lantern light revealed fragments of a story. A torn blanket, its faded colors barely visible through the dust. Old photographs, curled and yellowed with age, their images blurred but still showing the faint outlines of faces. Children, a woman smiling faintly, a family once whole. And at the very bottom, small and heartbreaking, a child's toy. A wooden horse, one wheel broken, the paint chipped away by tiny hands long gone. The sight froze everyone. Breath caught in throats. Tears welled uninvited. The toy was not just wood and paint. It was the echo of laughter that had once filled a home, the memory of a child who had played beneath sunlight before being swallowed by darkness. The shepherd let out a sharp bark, startling everyone. He stepped into the shallow hole and pressed his nose against the blanket, breathing deeply as if trying to pull the story from its fabric. Then he turned and growled again, refusing to let anyone else come closer. His body stood guard over the relics of pain, as though he alone understood their weight. The teacher wiped her eyes with trembling hands. "This isn't just a box," she whispered. "It's a grave for memories. Someone tried to bury their grief here." The policeman studied the photographs, his expression heavy. "And someone wanted us never to know." He reached out with gloved hands, but the shepherd snapped his jaws, teeth glinting in the lantern light. The growl that followed was not of anger at his friends, but of warning. "Be gentle, Respect this." The baby girl slipped down into the dirt, her dress catching on roots as she knelt beside her dog. She reached for the toy horse with innocent hands, brushing away the dust. She held it up toward the light, her small face serious, her eyes wide. "A child left this," she said softly, her voice carrying across the graveyard with the clarity only a child could bring. "A child wanted it to be found." Her words pierced the silence, cutting through doubt and fear. No one could deny it anymore. This was not an accident, not just discarded things. It was evidence of a life, of a story that had been hidden away in earth and shadow. The grandmother broke into quiet sobs, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I remember," she whispered, though her voice trembled too much to finish. The others looked at her, waiting, but she shook her head. It was too soon. The memories were still locked tight within her heart. The shepherd licked the baby girl's hand, then pressed his nose against the toy horse. His tail hung low, not wagging, his whole body heavy with sadness. It was as if he carried the grief of those who could not be there to mourn. The townsfolk drew closer, lanterns lifted, their faces pale in the flickering light. No one dared touch the photographs or the blanket again, not with the shepherd guarding them. They simply stood in silence, listening to the sound of the dog's steady breathing, the faint creak of the wooden box, the restless whisper of the wind through the graveyard grass. For a long time, no one spoke. The baby girl leaned against her shepherd, clutching the toy horse close to her chest. The dog's growl faded into a low, mournful whine, as if he too remembered the child who had once held it. And in that moment, every person standing there felt the same truth settling in their bones. This was not just a forgotten grave. It was the beginning of a story, one buried in sorrow, waiting now to be told. The night air hung heavy over the graveyard, carrying the weight of what had just been found. The wooden box lay open, its contents speaking louder than any words. People stood frozen, lanterns casting trembling shadows across the crooked stones. The German shepherd stayed pressed against the box, chest rising and falling in sharp breaths, as though he knew the silence that followed was about to be broken. Grandmother Elsie was the first to speak. Her voice was weak but steady, each word drawn from deep within her memory. "I was a girl when it happened," she said softly, eyes glistening as she looked at the photographs. "There were children who went missing back then, and they were never found." The crowd stirred uneasily. Whispers spread like the chill crawling through the grass. A farmer's wife covered her mouth, eyes wide. "I remember the mothers crying at the church steps," she murmured. "One of them waited at the cemetery gates every night, hoping someone would bring her boy back." The schoolteacher, a man with gray hair and a weary heart, lowered his head. "We thought it was just the times. A town struck by misfortune. Families torn apart." His voice trembled as he pointed toward the box. "But what if it wasn't chance? What if all along, the answers were buried here?" Lantern light fell over the broken photographs, their faded images catching the eye of an elderly man at the back of the group. He limped forward slowly, leaning heavily on his cane, his breath visible in the frosty air. His name was Mr. Callahan, one of the oldest living men in the town. He had seen wars and storms, births and burials. But his eyes clouded as he bent over the wooden box. "I know that blanket," he whispered. The crowd leaned closer. His hand trembled as he reached out but stopped short, as though afraid the memory itself might burn him. "My sister made one just like it, for her son." Gasps filled the air. People turned toward him, their faces pale. "You mean?" Someone started, but Mr. Callahan's voice broke. "Yes. He was only 6 years old when he vanished. His name was Peter. We searched everywhere, the woods, the rivers, the fields. My sister never stopped waiting. She would come here, to this graveyard, sit by the fence, and call his name into the night. I can still hear her voice, even now. The silence that followed was unbearable. The shepherd gave a low whine and pawed at the box again, as if confirming the truth of the old man's words. Then, with a sharp motion, the dog began scratching deeper into the soil at the edge of the box. Dirt flew against the lantern glow. His paws worked tirelessly until something small and delicate came loose from the earth. The baby girl gasped. "A shoe!" she cried, pointing as the shepherd gently nudged the object free with his nose. It was tiny, worn, but still whole. A child's leather shoe, its strap bent, its surface stiff with age. The crowd drew closer, eyes wide. The shoe was lifted carefully, dust falling like ashes from its seams. It looked impossibly fragile, yet it carried the weight of a tragedy that time had never erased. Elsie clutched her chest, tears sliding freely down her cheeks. "That was Peter's," she said. "I remember his mother showing me when she bought them. She said he'd outgrow them too fast, but she wanted him to have something new, something bright." The toy horse, the blanket, the shoe, each piece was no longer just an object. They were proof of lives interrupted, of a story that had been forced into silence. The crowd felt it in their bones. This grave held more than wood and cloth. It held grief. It held secrets. The schoolteacher shook his head slowly. "All these years, we walked past this grave and never knew." His voice carried a weight of guilt. "We let the stories fade into whispers, until even the whispers were gone. And all along, the truth lay here, waiting for someone who would not stop digging." The shepherd barked sharply, his deep chest echoing against the gravestones. He stood tall beside the box, his tail lowered, his eyes burning with purpose. It was as if he was saying, "You were blind, but I was not. I saw. I knew." A young mother in the crowd clutched her child closer, her tears falling onto the boy's hair. "No mother should wait at the cemetery gates for a child who never comes home," she whispered. "No family should carry a wound this deep." The policeman's face hardened. "If this grave hides one truth, it may hide others. We need to look deeper. This isn't just about memories, it's about justice long denied." But for the townsfolk, the discovery was already more than they could bear. Each object from the box pulled threads of their past, unraveling the fabric of stories they had tried to bury. Mothers who had cried themselves to sleep. Fathers who had broken under guilt. Families who had moved away, unable to live in the shadow of unanswered loss. The shepherd lowered his head and rested his nose gently on the small shoe. He stayed there for a long moment, his breath warm against the cracked leather. His eyes were soft, sorrowful, carrying a kind of understanding that words could never capture. Even the baby girl sensed it. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her cheek against his fur. "It's okay," she whispered. "We found him." The old man, Callahan, let his cane fall to the ground as he wiped his face with both hands. His sobs were quiet but raw. "My sister can rest now," he said. Maybe she always knew he was here." The townsfolk stood together, bound by a shared realization. This graveyard was not only a place of stone and earth, it was a keeper of unspoken truths. The sealed box, the toy, the blanket, the shoe, they were all pieces of a forgotten puzzle. And the German shepherd, with his unwavering vigil, had forced them to face it. As lanterns flickered and the wind whispered through the tall grass, one thought settled heavily on every heart. The grave was not simply different. It was a doorway to the past, one that had waited patiently for the right moment, and the right guardian, to open it. The graveyard had already given the townsfolk more than they had ever imagined. The box, the toy, the tiny shoe, all of it felt like the earth itself had whispered back the pain it had been forced to hold in silence. People thought that was the end of it. They thought the past had spoken, that nothing more could come from the broken soil. But as the lanterns flickered and the cold wind swept between the crooked stones, something new stirred. At first it was so faint that most dismissed it as the restless sound of the night. But the German shepherd knew better. His ears shot up, his body stiffened, and a low growl rolled from his chest. Then it came again, soft, muffled, and desperate. A whimper. Weak and trembling, the sound cut through the silence like a thread of life calling from the depths of the grave. The crowd froze, hearts thundering in their chests. A farmer's wife clutched her husband's sleeve, her voice shaking. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The schoolteacher leaned closer to the dug ground, straining to listen. His eyes widened with disbelief. "That's no wind," he murmured. "That's something alive." Before anyone could act, the shepherd sprang into the pit. His claws tore at the soil with a force that belonged to desperation itself. Dirt scattered into the air as he dug wildly, barking with a sharp urgency that rattled every lantern glass. The baby girl in her little blue dress clapped her hands and cried, "Help him! He knows someone's there." Her innocent plea broke the paralysis that had gripped the crowd. The townsfolk rushed forward. Lanterns were lowered to the edge of the pit, their trembling flames spilling light over the dog's frantic digging. Men with shovels struck the ground, their movements rough and fast, their breaths heavy with fear and hope tangled together. Then the sound came again, louder this time, pitiful and aching, the cry of something that had fought too long in the dark. Gasps spread like wildfire. Mothers covered their mouths, fathers whispered prayers, and old women clutched their rosaries as if to anchor themselves in a miracle. The policeman's voice rang out, tight with urgency. "Dig faster! Don't stop! Whatever's down there, it's alive!" But the shepherd needed no command. His entire body worked like a machine of loyalty and love. He clawed the soil with unyielding power, nose pressed deep into the damp ground, his heart locked on the fragile sound beneath. Minutes passed like hours. The cries faltered, growing weaker, and panic spread. Tears rolled down cheeks, and even the strongest among them felt helpless. The baby girl sobbed quietly, her tiny fists gripping her grandmother's skirt. "Please," she whispered through her tears, "please save it." Her voice, pure and pleading, pierced the hearts of everyone standing there. And then, at last, the shepherd struck something soft. His claws stopped, his nose pressed against the soil, and he barked with a tone none had heard before, a cry of triumph, of discovery. The farmer and the policeman dropped to their knees, throwing aside their tools and using their bare hands to tear at the earth. Dirt filled their nails, roots scraped their skin, but they didn't stop. Together, with the shepherd beside them, they pulled at the soil until the earth gave up its secret. In the lantern light, a small shape emerged. Fragile, trembling, barely breathing. A puppy. The graveyard fell silent in shock. The tiny creature's fur was caked with dirt, its ribs visible beneath its fragile body, and its eyes fluttered weakly against the sudden light. A faint whimper escaped its throat, but it was alive. The moments stretched, heavy and unreal, until someone whispered, "Dear God," then the silence broke. Cries, gasps, and sobs filled the graveyard. A grandmother fell to her knees in tears. A farmer clutched his chest. Others clasped hands together, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The shepherd stepped back, his proud eyes fixed on the tiny life he had unearthed. The farmer lifted the puppy carefully from the soil, his rough hands trembling as though he held a piece of heaven itself. The little creature shivered violently, its body frail and cold, but its small paws stretched weakly toward the warmth of the world it had been pulled into. The baby girl rushed forward before anyone could stop her. With her tiny arms, she wrapped the puppy close to her chest, pressing her cheek against its dirty fur. "You're safe now," she whispered gently, rocking the little one as though she had known it forever. "We found you." Her voice, so pure and innocent, carried through the night like a blessing. The shepherd stood beside her, tall and proud. His chest heaved with deep breaths, his eyes fierce yet soft, and his posture protective. He had guarded the grave, uncovered the truth, and now he would guard this tiny soul too. The puppy whimpered again, its nose burying into the folds of the girl's dress. The crowd melted at the sight. Hardened men lowered their heads, tears slipping silently down weathered faces. Mothers wept openly, clutching their own children tighter. The policeman swallowed hard, his voice thick with emotion. "I've seen many things," he said hoarsely, "but never this. Never a living soul pulled back from the grave." The schoolteacher adjusted his fogged glasses, his voice breaking as he spoke. "We came searching for stories of the past," he said, "but tonight, life itself was returned to us." The farmer's wife wept into her husband's chest, her sobs shaking her whole body. And yet amidst the sorrow, something else took root: hope. For a moment, the graveyard, once feared and forgotten, became a place of light, where even in the soil of grief, life could bloom again. The shepherd circled the baby girl and the puppy, his nose brushing gently against the small creature's fur. For the first time that night, his tail wagged softly, a solemn sign of approval. It was his vow, silent yet unbreakable. This life would not be lost again. The baby girl looked up at the crowd, her eyes bright despite the dirt and tears streaking her cheeks. "He was crying," she said softly, her voice carrying with innocence and certainty. "But we heard him. We saved him." No one could find words in response. They only nodded, their hearts shattered and healed all at once. Lantern flames danced across the damp ground, illuminating the pit where sorrow had once slept. Now, in its place, a miracle stirred. A fragile puppy, alive and breathing, carried from the darkness by a shepherd's loyalty and a child's love. The graveyard's whispers of tragedy had turned into a song of rescue, a reminder that even in the coldest ground, hope waits to be uncovered. The townsfolk would never forget that night. They would tell the story again and again, not as a tale of graves and sorrow, but as the night life itself was pulled from the earth. And every time they told it, they would remember the German shepherd who refused to give up, the baby girl who wrapped her arms around hope, and the tiny cry in the dark that brought them all to tears. The graveyard was no longer silent. The small puppy, pulled alive from the soil, whimpered softly in the arms of the baby girl, and the entire town moved as one to protect the fragile spark of life they had found. The German shepherd stood proudly at her side, his deep eyes never leaving the little bundle that had been rescued from the dark. Everyone knew the night was not over. The puppy needed more than love. It needed care, warmth, and the touch of healing hands. Lanterns lit the way as the townsfolk carried the girl and the puppy toward the waiting cart at the edge of the cemetery. The local policeman, his voice still hoarse with emotion, barked quick instructions. "We must take it to the vet now, quickly before it fades." The farmer laid his coat gently across the girl's lap, wrapping both her and the puppy against the biting cold. The baby girl rocked the little creature softly, whispering, "Don't be afraid. You're safe now." The shepherd trotted beside the cart, his paws firm on the ground, his ears alert as if guarding a treasure more precious than gold. The veterinary clinic stood at the corner of town, a small brick building that had mended countless animals over the years. Its warm yellow lights were still glowing when they arrived, and the bell above the door jingled sharply as they rushed inside. Dr. Miller, an older man with gentle hands and tired eyes, hurried forward the moment he saw the bundle. Without hesitation, he cleared a space on his examination table. The puppy was laid down carefully, its small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Dr. Miller bent low, his stethoscope pressed against the fragile ribs. His face was lined with concentration, but when he looked up, There was a flicker of relief. "It's weak," he said, his voice calm yet urgent, "but it's alive. With food, warmth, and rest, it has a chance." Warm blankets were fetched, milk was prepared in a small bottle, and gentle hands worked together as if the whole town had suddenly become one family. The shepherd stood close by, eyes fixed on the little creature, his nose twitching at every movement. When the puppy gave a faint cry as milk touched its lips, the crowd broke into quiet gasps. The sound was small, but to them it was a miracle, proof that life was fighting its way back. The baby girl sat in a chair nearby, her blue dress rumpled and stained with soil, her cheeks streaked with tears and dirt. Yet she smiled through it all, her innocent eyes locked on the puppy as it nursed weakly from the bottle. Every time the tiny creature swallowed, she giggled softly, her small hands clapping together in delight. That smile, so pure and unshaken, melted even the hardest hearts in the room. Grown men wiped their faces quietly, pretending to hide their tears, while mothers let their sobs fall freely. The news of the night's miracle spread quickly through the town. People who had once whispered about sorrow now gathered at the clinic door, waiting to hear how the puppy fared. Candles were lit along the streets, prayers whispered into the cold air. For years, the graveyard had been a symbol of loss, but tonight it had given back something that no one expected: hope. The German shepherd became the hero of the hour. Word spread of how he had refused to move from the grave, how he had barked, scratched, and dug until the truth was uncovered. Children who once feared the old cemetery now looked at him with wide-eyed admiration. Elders who had carried grief for decades placed their hands on his head and whispered blessings through trembling lips. He stood tall through it all, calm and proud, as though he understood the weight of what he had done. In the days that followed, the puppy grew stronger. Fed with care, wrapped in warmth, and surrounded by love, its cries turned from weak whimpers to brighter sounds. The baby girl never left its side, her tiny arms always ready to hold it, her soft voice always ready to soothe it. The shepherd remained its guardian, his nose checking every breath, his body curling protectively whenever the puppy slept. The town, too, began to change. Where there had once been shadows, there was now light. Where there had been sorrow, there was now healing. The graveyard was no longer spoken of only in whispers of loss. It was remembered as the place where a loyal dog's instincts, a child's innocence, and a community's courage had brought back life. One evening, as the townsfolk gathered outside the clinic to check on the puppy, the baby girl stepped forward, holding the small creature in her arms. Its fur was cleaner now, its eyes brighter, though still fragile. She lifted it high for all to see, her little voice ringing out. "He's okay now. He's not alone anymore." The crowd broke into gentle applause, some clapping through their tears, others simply bowing their heads in gratitude. The shepherd barked once, loud and strong, the sound echoing across the street like a declaration of victory. In that moment, everyone knew that the graveyard's sorrow had been transformed into something new. The wounds of the past had not been erased, but they had been softened by hope, by healing, by love. And at the center of it all stood a faithful dog, a small girl in a blue dress, and a fragile puppy whose cry in the dark had brought an entire town together. The graveyard, once avoided and feared, had become the heart of the town. A week had passed since the night the German shepherd refused to leave the grave, and people still spoke of it in hushed voices, as though it were a sacred story unfolding before their eyes. That evening, under a pale moon and the soft glow of lanterns, the townsfolk gathered once more at the edge of the cemetery. What had once been a place of shadows was now lit with rows of candles, each flame flickering against the stones, each one a prayer for the past and a promise for the future. Flowers were placed gently on the ground, bright against the dark soil. Some brought roses, others wildflowers picked from fields, and a few placed little tokens of remembrance. A child's ribbon, a carved wooden toy, a small cross. Each offering was simple, but together they created a tapestry of love and memory across the forgotten grave. The shepherd lay quietly nearby, his head raised, his eyes watchful, as if he understood the gathering was in his honor but also in honor of all those who had been lost. The old grandmother, Elsie, stepped forward first. Her voice trembled as she lit her candle, the flame casting a glow over her lined face. "For the children we lost and never found," she whispered, "and for the ones we saved at last." Tears shone in her eyes, but her lips curved into a faint smile. "May their spirits rest, and may we never again close our eyes to what our hearts try to tell us." Others followed, each sharing their own words. The schoolteacher, his voice steady but heavy with memory, spoke of how silence can wound a community more than noise ever could. "We taught ourselves to stop asking questions," he admitted softly. "But tonight proved that some answers remain, waiting, if only we are brave enough to listen." A farmer told of his father's grief, how he had grown bitter after losing a neighbor's son, and how he wished his father had lived to see this moment of healing. The policeman, his hand resting lightly on the shepherd's back, simply said, "It wasn't us who found the truth. It was him." He pointed to the dog, and the crowd murmured in agreement. The German shepherd lifted his head at the sound of their voices. He did not wag his tail or bark, but his steady gaze seemed to carry a wisdom far older than the town itself. The rescued puppy, now stronger and more playful, stumbled forward clumsily, tugging at the shepherd's ear with tiny teeth. The crowd laughed softly through their tears, their heavy hearts lightened by the sight. The baby girl, dressed again in her little blue dress, crouched beside them, giggling as she tried to scoop up the puppy, who wriggled free and tumbled into the shepherd's waiting paws. It was a picture no one would forget: innocence, loyalty, and new life playing together against the backdrop of a grave once sealed by sorrow. It was as if the ground itself had been transformed. Where once it had held secrets and silence, now it rang with laughter, barks, and the unspoken promise of renewal. Sometimes animals guard truths humans have long ignored. Sometimes their loyalty leads us to confront the very things we chose to forget. And sometimes, in their courage, we find our own healing. Candles flickered in agreement, their light pushing back the darkness. The townsfolk stood closer together, not just as neighbors but as family. They shared stories of loyalty remembered, of grief endured, of healing that had begun at last. For the first time in many years, the graveyard felt less like a place of endings and more like a place of unity. The baby girl lifted the puppy high in her arms, her laughter carrying into the night. "He's happy now," she declared proudly. The shepherd barked once, low and strong, as if to confirm her words. People smiled, some wiping their eyes, others reaching out to clasp the hands of those beside them. From that night forward, the graveyard was no longer just stone and soil. It became a symbol. The place where sorrow turned into strength, where silence gave way to truth, and where a dog's devotion had reminded everyone of what truly mattered. Children no longer feared its gates, and mothers did not hush their little ones when they passed. Instead, families came to place flowers, to light candles, and to remember that even in forgotten corners, love can still be found. The shepherd, the baby girl, and the rescued puppy remained at the heart of it all. Their bond became a story told again and again, of how loyalty uncovered secrets, of how innocence offered hope, and of how love had stitched a broken community back together. It was no longer just their story, it belonged to everyone. As the crowd slowly drifted home that night, the candles remained, glowing like stars across the graves. The shepherd lay down near the puppy and the girl, his body a shield, his eyes soft. The puppy curled into the crook of the girl's arm, its breathing steady and safe. And in the stillness, the town realized they were not only mourning what had been lost, they were celebrating what had been found. The night in the graveyard had ended, but its memory would live on forever. What began as a mystery, a German shepherd refusing to move from a forgotten grave, had turned into a lesson no one in the town would ever forget. Out of darkness had come light. Out of sorrow had come healing. And out of silence had come a cry that reminded them all of the value of life, no matter how small or fragile. The shepherd had shown what many had long ignored, that animals often sense truths our eyes and hearts choose not to see. His loyalty, unshaken and pure, had pulled the town back to a place they had once feared and forced them to confront the grief they had buried. Yet he had also brought them something else, something brighter, a tiny puppy, alive against all odds, a symbol that even in the coldest soil, hope can still grow. The baby girl, in her blue dress, had stood beside him through it all. She had not questioned his instincts or dismissed his strange behavior. Instead, she had trusted him with the innocence that only children carry. It was her small arms that cradled the rescued puppy, her soft voice that whispered comfort, and her radiant smile that melted the hearts of everyone around her. In her innocence, the town found courage. In her laughter, they found healing. The townsfolk, who had once avoided the graveyard, now came together as a family. Candles and flowers lined the stones, not as reminders of sorrow, but as signs of unity. Stories of loss and loyalty were shared, and with each word, the cracks of the past began to mend. The graveyard was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of remembrance, love, and renewal. And so, dear listener, we are left with a truth as old as time. Sometimes it takes the loyalty of an animal and the innocence of a child to remind us of what truly matters. Loyalty does not fade. Love does not die. And even in the darkest places, hope can still rise, fragile but unbroken. Do you believe that dogs sense what humans cannot? That their hearts hear whispers our own often miss? Tonight's story is proof that their loyalty is not just companionship. It is a gift, a bridge between what is seen and what is hidden. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in kindness, who still believes in the quiet miracles that surround us. And before you go, let this not only be a story you heard, but a reminder you carry with you, to trust loyalty, to cherish innocence, and to honor the bonds that heal us all. If this tale warmed your heart, leave us a comment. Tell us where you're listening from, and let your story join ours. Subscribe for more moments that remind us that hope is never lost. It is simply waiting to be found. Because in the end, the shepherd's vigil was not just about a grave. It was about love that refused to be silenced. And that, dear listener, is a truth worth holding close.